Hey everybody, it's Liz joining you as usual from Central Virginia and the ancestral lands of the Monica Nation, and I am so glad that you're here. If you want to know whose indigenous lands you might be residing on, check out the site native-land.ca. Pretty cool. They show not just the United States, but I think they've got a map of the whole world. It's kind of neat. So I'll put that in the show notes, but that might be a good thing for you to research. And before we jump in, I just want to mention my book, Home to Her, Walking the Transformative Path of the Sacred Feminine. If you're into this conversation of the sacred feminine, you like it, you've been here for a while, or maybe you're new to it and reading is your thing, then check out the book. It's published by Womancraft Publishing, and you can order it directly from them, which I always encourage because it's just an amazing woman-owned business, and I like to support them. And then I also have to do a little, self brag here that my book won a 2023 Nautilus Gold Award for, those are books that are that promote spiritual growth and conscious living and sustainability. So it's a big deal for me. I was pretty excited to get it. So if you're interested in the book, go and check it out. And if you've read it, I would be so grateful for your favorable reviews. Those are particularly helpful on Amazon and on Goodreads. Yeah, and I'd love to hear from you too. Send me a note, email, or via social. I love to hear what's coming up for you and what you think if you've read it. And then the same goes with this podcast. If you are listening and you enjoy it, I would be so grateful for your reviews. Reviews on Apple Podcasts really help, but I'll take them anywhere. And same thing, if this sparks thoughts for you or ideas, anything you want to feedback, feel free to reach out. And then one last plug here. If you are interested in these spiritual dialogues and you just happen to want to travel to Chicago this summer to be at the Parliament of World Religions, come and join me. I'm going to be part of a panel discussion with 4 other incredible women. We're going to be talking about how to foster intersectionality in earth-based traditions. This feels like such an edgy and important topic, and I'm just really honored to be a part of it. And from what I understand about the Parliament, there are thousands of people who come to this from all over the world. So I think it's going to be really special. So yeah, I'll put the registration details in the show notes in case you want to check that out. And with that, let's get on with it, shall we? All right, so I met my guest today late last year when my book was coming out, and I had the honor of being a guest on her podcast. And I really, really loved that conversation. There are sometimes, I'll have conversations with people and I feel like I've just walked away with a new friend, and no pressure to my guest here. She didn't feel the same way. But that's how I felt after that conversation. And I just loved her energy, her spirit, and all the things she's bringing to the world. So I knew that I wanted to have her join me on this show. And I know that we have a lot to talk about. So let me go ahead and introduce her to you now. Hannah Wallace is the host of the podcast Finding Grace, where she holds space for conversations about what it means to find grace in the world we live in today. As someone who lives with a life-altering genetic condition, her mission is to guide people to integrate their darkness and light by finding grace in the space they're in. Hannah is also a disability model, an advocate, a writer, blogger, speaker, and priestess. And she is joining us today from her home in Plymouth, Devon, in the UK. Hannah, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad this is finally happening.
I am so glad this is finally happening. And thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I felt exactly the same after our conversation. It felt, when you have a conversation, it feels like a warm hug, and you come away with your cup feeling overfilled. And it really did feel like that. So it's so good to be back on the other side of the microphone, being interviewed by you and having the opportunity to share in a different way than what I normally do. So yeah, great to be here today.
Yes, I know we're going to have lots to talk about. And, obviously this will be in the show notes, but you really should check out Hannah's podcast. It's beautiful. She does this nice blend of talking to different people, but then also sharing your reflections so beautifully too. And it's really special. I do love what you're doing. So listeners, go check it out after this for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I usually like to start with people by asking about your spiritual background and what it was like for you growing up. And I am always curious about that. I'm curious about how that, intersects with the sacred feminine at some point, but I'm also curious about, was it helpful for you? Was it not helpful for you? What did you keep? What did you feel like you needed to toss out? What pointed you in the right direction and what maybe misguided you? So, if that's all right with you, I'd love to start there.
Oh, I love this question. And it's funny because I guess not a lot of people always ask me that question directly. So from a very, very young age, I kind of knew I was a bit different. And I grew up with very kind of around very, should we say, regular people. And by the time I was like 11 or 12, I decided I was getting into like yoga and meditation and like angels and all of these things. And I was just known amongst everybody kind of that was around me as the weird one, really. But thankfully for me, it was like really accepted, and I just read and got into it. And my I had very normal friends, so I had nobody in my life doing this. So it was just me, solo, just me. And I would read books, I would, I practiced as well with the yoga, and got my first decks, my angel cards, my tarot decks. And this went on for a period of time. And when I was 17, I became very, very, very sick. Like we're talking like life changing, like overnight, from a normal active teenager to becoming like basically bedbound. And I think that was the point in time where I understood what faith was, and I understood what spirituality was, because it was almost like the darkness came
Mm,
overnight. And it I felt lost in that darkness, but there was that glimmer of light and hope because of the background that I'd already come from. That once the initial shock of what was happening to me kind of sunk in, and I was just able to kind of process the fact that I needed to survive, to be kind of for a few months just be okay, learn to be able to get out of bed and function in a normal way. It was then that, because really Western medicine didn't have so much to offer me at the time, my mum and I embarked on a more alternative journey, beginning with acupuncture and these kind of things. And obviously, luckily, because my mind was open to these things, and at the same time, I was still continuing my meditation and yoga practice. And I think it was really then that I really understood the power of the angelic presence in my life, because
mm,
felt so disconnected from everyone in my life and the world, and almost like very alone. I was very loved because I was obviously very, very supported, thankfully, but no one really understood what was happening to me. Barely I understood what was happening. And it was almost that faith in a really weird way, and the fact that I could access books, back in the day when pretty much it was just your Hay House books that we would pick up. This is 25 years ago. So it was very limited and very niche. And my sister actually worked in Waterstone, so she would bring me home the books that I liked. And this really began my spiritual path, very much solo and alone at that point, because really there wasn't, like I say, many people in my life. So I just sunk into it. I simultaneously continued to have all the normal people around me, but I was embarking on this journey. And in a way, it saved me. It helped me eventually get myself out of depression, because obviously when you're really sick and you're young and your whole life is turned upside down, I got depressed. And really, I look back now and I understand that was grief. And I'm really thankful to the kind of very regular doctor that I walked into when I was like, in a pretty bad way. And I said to her, I need tablets. I need help. Like I can't cope. And she said, I think you need to grieve.
mm.
And that was like a fairly shocking thing to say to a 19-year-old, when you're thinking, what are you talking about? And she said, you need to grieve, because the person who you were at 17 has gone. Like,
Mm.
you need to catch up with yourself. And that was very liberating to be told that. And I feel that it was a very healing process to be put on. And it took me a few years to get to a point where thankfully I was far down a rabbit hole at this point, trying anything I could get my hands on to help myself, any alternative therapy that was out there. I was like, I need to try this, I need to do this. I always had the base of my spiritual practice of meditation and prayer and that faith that just kept me going, that an answer would have to come, and then that support. But it really was a moment when I got to a point where I thought, I have a choice here. I might not be able to control what's happening in my body, but maybe I can help my mind by choosing peace. And
Mm.
ultimately that point, when I was about 20, changed my life, because it was like the liberation of, okay, I can work with this. I've got something to work with now. And that's taken me to where I am now, on a very long, as you can imagine, journey of ups and downs. And it took me 10 years to find out what was wrong with me as well. um and that in itself was a whole journey, because I think during parts of that I used to think, I know something is really not right here, but then I'd be on this spiritual path where I'd be thinking, I'm doing all this work, and why am I not this fully healed? Why is the divine not come down and heal? Like all of these questions that we're going to have on these paths. And I think that was my journey. That's where finding grace came from, because ultimately it was a point where I had to meet myself with grace and be like, you're human. You're human living this spiritual experience. Give yourself grace. And it was pulling back. And eventually, by the time I entered into my 30s, I realized I spent a large proportion of my life very dedicated to my path, like separately. I'd been going through this health crisis, but at the same time, this deeply spiritual path, which kind of, I always separated between the two. I always saw myself not as this sick person, but more as this, I was on this spiritual path. And thankfully, by this point, I'd met quite a few people along the way who were more similar to me, which was great, because going it alone for a long time, it can feel very lonely. And it's led me to where I am today. And I feel grateful, and I feel grateful with work you're doing with the sacred feminine. I feel the goddess and the sacred feminine has showed up for me so much along the way, and been a guide, and made me remember who I am, despite everything. That at the core of everything, there is this light, this presence. And that even when I've had to walk, in the darkness, the underworld, there's always been that grace and that light. And that is testament to all this energy and this sacredness that exists, within us, among us, and around us, below us, and above us.
Yes. Oh, I love that. And I want to hear you talk more about this relationship to the sacred feminine. But before that, I want to ask you a question about, so I think that there can be, I'm just curious about how you related to your, I don't know, Hannah, help me with the right words. I was going to say your condition. Does that feel right? Like because you have a genetic condition, right? It is something you live with. It's not going away. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's there. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And please feel free, by the way, if I fumble around, to just, correct me. It did point me in the right direction. But I guess the question that I have is, I think sometimes if we are looking at like spiritual information and how to understand illness or chronic illness, there can be a way of looking at it. Well, if you just cleared out this energy vibe in your body, then I'd be better, right? I had a 2 or 3 year period of chronic pain that took a really long time to figure out. And so I feel like I went down that rabbit hole a lot. Well, if I just processed my anger more, or there's and I think there's that undercurrent there can be in the spiritual community. And so I'm curious if you ran into that kind of understanding what was going on with you, and how you reconciled that, or worked with that and got to this point of grace that you're describing.
Well, I absolutely felt that. And I I think I felt it very, very early on, because I guess in my naivety, I'd read various books, read various stories, and I assumed that if I followed the protocols, did the stuff, did the clearing, showed up, however challenging, however hard the journeys, the processes, the ancestral clearing, I mean, you name it, it got to the point where I think I would have eaten poo. It was like that level of extremity,
Wow.
which in itself I realized is that, like, there's a line, and I think what I came to realize is that life isn't black and white, life isn't linear, being human isn't linear, and we're not here to be perfect. And I think what I was doing was showing up to this world and showing up in this ways. If I show up as the A-star student to spirit, I'm gonna get that. And that's, shall we say, the undercurrents you talked about, the toxic spirituality, that it exists. And I think it's a slightly taboo thing to talk about, that it's almost like, if you're not better, if you're not perfect, there's something wrong with you. And I will tell you, for a long time, I battled with this thing of, like, I had the normal kind of outside, shall we say, that the regular world being like, okay, you're not better, like, this is, like, I had that view. And then the world where I almost had sought my peace and solace, I also had this other spiritual view. And I had to come to a place where I was like, I need to let go, I need to surrender, and I just need to do me. And I realized that in all of this journey that I've been on, that I'd almost stopped being me. I'd stopped having fun. I'd stopped being human. And my life was like dedicated that if I do this, this is going to be my answer. And it was actually, thankfully, a therapist who I was seeing, an alternative therapist. And she put a question, obviously I was paying this person, and she asked me one day, and she said, have you ever thought about giving up? And I looked at her like, what? I'm paying you, and you've just said to me, have you thought about giving up? She said, well, I'm just curious, because she said, I think you need to let go. And she said, I don't want to take your money anymore. She said, I really like you, and I'm happy to come to your house for a cup of tea. But she said, I think you just need to live your life. And, I joke that was like the come to Jesus moment of, like, I mean, it took a long time to land with me, because the part of my brain that was so used to what can I do next, and believe me, the lesson from this has continued to follow me, like, into my 30s. Whenever, like, something would happen, if something new happened to me, I would instantly end up down this obsessive rabbit hole. And it really wasn't until a couple of years ago that I decided to look at this pattern and understand my nervous system for pretty much the entire time, which, no matter where I'd gone to, no matter where I'd seen, no matter, how out there, no one had just turned around to me and said, your nervous system needs some peace and needs some regulation. And it's not about all of this stuff. It's about you being happy. And I remember thinking, like, in all of the things that I was doing, no one ever once turned around to me and said, how about making happiness your priority? How about making joy your priority? How about having fun as making it your priority? And I realized I felt guilty for doing those things. If I, wasn't seen to be out there healing or doing the right thing, there was this guilt. And so, yeah, to answer to your question, it's been a long ride, and it's taken a lot of unpacking, a lot of unraveling, and a lot of discomfort, having to meet a world that I've had to meet, the world of, like, the Western medicine world, with the blocks that you find there, and then had to meet the world that I thought would be my answer. I had to meet that as well. And I think for anybody listening, because I will guarantee you, having had this conversation with many people with this journey that I've been on, mostly behind closed doors because people are afraid more to talk about it. That a lot of people feel these things, and they don't know how to navigate it because they don't know how to put words to it in a way where they don't want to be quote unquote saying the wrong thing or saying the negative thing, or well, if I say that, it means that I don't want to get better or something, or all of these crazy things. And really, my invitation to anybody is live your life, choose love, choose, you know, before we began this conversation, I shared with you about the loss of somebody that I really cared about. That was a real shocking moment in my life of being like, all that time, and now that's gone. That person is
Mhm.
gone. And we waste so much time on all of these other things. And sometimes we need to choose life. We need to
Yeah.
live. And it reminds me in that finding grace, in those moments of finding grace, that choosing life and meeting that every single day is the greatest gift in whatever way we are, because I think it can get so confusing and so constricting when we often can think when we enter into these paths that we're choosing freedom, right? I'm sure you've been there yourself, and we can end up constricting ourselves within those paths as well without us even realizing, and that's part of our journey and part of our process. But I think it's always having the awareness to be like, if you're starting to question yourself, be like, where is the constriction here? Because sometimes we're always going for ourselves, because that's where our natural nature as humans, especially women, will tend to go for ourselves. The nature of blame, like the deep conditioning programming in the feminine that has existed through millennia, through all of our DNAs, our mothers, our grandmothers, all of those things. And it's on ourselves. It's your fault. And I think
Yes.
it's us as women, and to help each other as well, to say, I'm here to help lift that burden, and that it isn't always your fault. Like, we have to take self-responsibility. I agree with that, but I mean, I took self-responsibility too far, and I have had to go back many times to all those versions of myself and be like, I love you, and like lift those burdens where I pushed myself to the point where it was no longer healing. What I thought
Yeah.
was going to heal me was almost blocking me. It took me a long time to see it as well, because it seemed so counterintuitive to the world that I felt I was in. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a complex subject, isn't it? And I think it's like the goddess herself. Um, that's why she shows up. That's why she's come to unravel us in this way. It's not meant to be, we want the linear, we want the answer, we want the masculine thing, but the bottom line of it is, it's just not like that.
Yeah. What I'm so glad you said that. As I was thinking about, yeah, I want to weave in that sacred feminine perspective. But what I was thinking as you were talking about this is that there's the, go figure, I see patriarchy everywhere. It's, but I think about what you're describing as um, like performative spirituality. Like, if I just show up as a good person and a good girl, if I am a
Yeah,
good girl specifically,
yeah,
then then the Father God will see me, even if we're not. And what's so interesting to me is that you weren't describing any kind of restrictive religious experience growing up, and yet, I think we can fall into this thinking because it's like the soup that we're swimming in, or like it's the air that we're breathing. And so that's what I'm thinking of. Well, if I just do the right things, then the divine will reward me and will see my devotion, and then I won't be in pain anymore. And that feels like a very patriarchal idea.
absolutely. And I think it's a real moment for us all to realize that that is so heavily weaved. And I think, like, I'm sure yourself, I feel like some days I'm still unpacking that, because we meet that in every aspect and every corner of our lives. It's it's raged forever, right? So,
Yeah.
and it's us realizing that we're not meant to be perfect. And I think, something I look at in when, in this spiritual world especially, we see, you don't really see people of difference much, or people showing up on public platforms.
Mhm.
And that has been something I have personally chosen to do. Quite a well-known author once said to me, um, where there's a space, I think it's time for someone to show up, and I think that person is you. And she was right. Like, if there isn't space, make space for yourself. Like,
Mhm.
and the more that people who are different do show up, and the more that people are saying, just because I, quote unquote, I'm seen as, I could be seen as blocked or broken, or however people would want to look, I'm fine just as I am. And I always remember, and I was having a conversation with somebody, with a project that I'm involved with, and I said to this person, I said, really, the quote that I want to use here is actually from Bridget Jones' Diary, in the film, where Mr. Darcy says to Bridget, I like you and I love you just the way you are. And it was interesting that then she went to her friends, and we talk about the patriarchy response, and our friends were saying, he likes you just as you are. You're not too fat, you're not problematic, you're not too... And that is all that's all of our brainwashing from patriarchy, that we cannot show up just as we are.
Yes.
And why not? And the more that we do that, and we say, I'm not here to be, I'm not here to be the good girl, I'm not here to be the shiny penny, I'm here to be just myself, fully myself, wholly myself. And that in itself is so freaking holy. Like, when I met myself in those ways, I realized that is where the divine is.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I want you to say more about that too, in the sacred feminine, specifically, if that was like a moment. But one thing I want to say real quick before I forget, because I do remember on our conversation, you said something to the effect of, I don't remember how our conversation was going, but you said something to the effect of, the goddess comes in a wheelchair too. And I'm like, well, hell yes, she does. Of course she does. It made me think of another podcast guest that I had last year, Christina Cleveland, who's a Black woman who wrote a book called God is a Black Woman. And her challenge to women, white women in particular, was like, if you were thinking of the Black Madonna or the dark feminine in metaphorical terms, you have not gone far enough. God is a Black woman. And until you can wrap your head around that, you haven't really understood it. And so I think what you're saying is so important and so powerful, that that divine, it doesn't look all the same, and finding the divinity in every aspect and every expression is the challenge and the gift.
Mm. And also that people who are different in this world have been hidden or hide,
Yeah.
and are afraid to show up. And I know for me, there was a period of time where everyone was like, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you showing up? Why aren't you talking? Why aren't you writing? Why aren't you doing? And the God to honest truth was, I didn't feel worthy. I didn't feel good enough, because I thought people were going to question.
Mm.
And thank God, the goddess, God, all of you above and below, to those humans that showed up and were like, no, the time is now. And then when I did show up, so many people said, it's like, you're not even just showing up as a new person. And I was like, that's because I've been doing this for years, just not, in a more
Mm.
public way. And I want to go back to those versions of me and say, you were okay to show up all of those times. And I want people to look, and anyone listening that feels different, to say, I can do that, and I can be represented, I can be seen, and it's safe. And I think it boils back down to good old patriarchy, because this is deep, deep, deep brainwashing that we all have, that it's almost not safe to be seen unless you're showing up in the correct way.
Yes.
And we don't even know that. It's like the kind of deeper consciousness nervous system of all these places that we believe are feminine or spiritual. There's still an undertone of patriarchy. And I feel like those walls have finally started to come down. And, you know, if we look around in this industry, we don't see many people sat in wheelchairs on stages. There are none, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah.
But someone's, as somebody, I heard somebody say not so long ago, someone's got to come to the dance floor first.
Mm.
So that's me.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think it's meeting people in those spaces and also giving each of us the courage, because we've all got shadow, right? And even if we so-called look perfect on the outside, we're all afraid of our shadow because we don't want people to see that vulnerable side of ourselves. And it's just, in a way, how I'm showing up in the world is it's out there, it's visibly to be seen. And it's no different than somebody's inner shadow as well. And I think it's that permission slip for us all to just be as we are.
Mm-hmm. And to know that that being isn't a static state either, right? Like, just show up. Like, if you are also messy and insecure, or whatever thing is going on for you, you've got a raging headache, you're like, I don't know, any of that all that's okay too. Like, that
Okay.
fluidity and flexibility is part of it.
And actually that is what really the core of what should be at spirituality. And that I think we need to take away what we believe needs to be the fixed ideas of healing, and realize, like you say, with fluidity, we can continue to show up in different ways. The most healing thing we can do for ourselves is to do that.
Mhm.
That's where the healing is. That's where the magic is. And when we can start to see that, we begin to embody that, and we embody our own truth. And I feel like the sacred she begins to show up through us in a different way, and can channel through in ways that we didn't even think were possible.
Mhm. Mm. Well, yes, and tell me about the sacred she and what that means to you. And I'd love to know if, so you mentioned on your journey you felt like, you developed this relationship with, and you choose your language of, divine mother, sacred feminine, divine feminine, whatever feels right for you. But was there like a specific point in your health journey or your just overall spiritual journey that you felt like you began to understand this aspect of spiritual presence as having, a feminine quality? Or what's that like been like for you?
I feel like ever since I was a teenager, the Aquarian rebel in me always allowed her to be. I felt this deep connection from a young age to Mother Mary.
Mm,
And it was like the rebel in me that has always been there, even in my darkest times, even in the times when I felt I lost my voice. That rebel always knew the goddess was there. Or, however you want to use those words. I feel they're so interchangeable, changeable, but it was always felt. And I feel so grateful for that, and I feel guided. I felt that guidance with me always, to the point where actually many years ago, I had I don't know if you know, the symbols related to Mary Magdalene, this cross of Cameroon, I can never pronounce it, but it's an anchor, a cross, and a heart. And
mm,
that for me was the anchor of love that was within me. And I felt that. And it's like, wherever I've journeyed throughout this life, it's fascinated me throughout art, just in like regular, patriarchal man painted art. Like, I love how she has showed up, and I've gone to galleries all over the world and I get excited because I'm like, there she is showing up, even though she can't fully put her name to this. She's woven throughout these pictures, throughout the, especially like religious art, for instance, or
Mhm.
when I went to India to feel the goddess and Kali Ma, and yeah, that has always been present with me. And I think I don't even know where it came from. I cannot describe this. It's like my soul knew.
Yeah.
It was like a knowing um that existed, that it felt like it was woven. And it felt, when I used to bring it up when I was younger, I felt all the resistance around me to it, and it has been truly magnificent to watch this unravel, where it's it's so accepted in ways that we never, the patriarchal, aspects are still raging. um but as we know, Rome wasn't built in a day, and it's a shift, isn't it, a consciousness shift, and it's happening. But yeah, I feel blessed that that has been a deep part of my journey.
Mm. Yeah, I sometimes wonder, I'm like, is it just me? Like, now that I'm on this path, I just like meet people all the time who understand this. It's far less likely that I'm gonna be in a situation where maybe that's not entirely true, but I do feel like I see what you're saying, that the sacred feminine is much more present. Like we talk about it, this idea of goddesses, it feels much more present to me than it did, say, 10 years ago when I was first kind of learning about this. And I'm like, is it just me? Like, am I just surrounded myself? Have I shifted my own worldview, or is the world outside of me shifting too? I think it's both. Feels like both.
I think it's both, and I think it's when we show up, when more and more of us continually show up, I think naturally life responds back to us in the ways that it needs to, and it
Yeah.
brings us the people, the teachers, the lessons, the magic, in all of those ways. It's that constant, feminine web, right? The interweaving, the lines that aren't straight. And I think for me, when I was much younger, I followed a very tantric path as well, and I feel the goddess was very woven within to much of that as well. And also, I had this wild idea when I was younger, and I used to say to my girlfriends, the rebel side of me, this was, well, if men can do that, then I can do what I want as well. I mean, obviously, it was so wholly shocking to everybody around me. It was like I had this like deeply spiritual side, then this deeply wild side. Well, I'll do what the hell I want, because if they can,
Mm.
I can do it. And that was so shocking. Whereas now I think, things are really changing, and I think for me there was a journey back to the, for so long I almost felt like I was having to almost compete against men to bring that feminine, whereas now I've been able to soften and release those layers and realize that those younger versions of me, I don't need to, I can just be, without having those walls up, feeling I need to do that anymore. And that for me was liberating too. But I think it was frustration when I was younger. It was a frustration that, why does it appear to be that there's one rule for the masculine and another rule for the feminine? And my inner rebel struggled with that and was vocal with that.
Mhm.
um and yeah, it's been a journey of finding grace in all of the ways, which is why I feel so deeply connected to that word. And I feel um that she has shown up to me in that way, and brought me to my knees almost, and brought me to grace.
Mm. Yeah, there's this thing that I'm thinking about listening to you talk. I'm thinking of absence and presence, and I was actually kind of relating it to what you were saying earlier on about when you were like, "I'll do anything, I'll try anything. Like I got to figure out how to get better," and that perspective. And you tell me if this feels right, or feel free to refute that. But it feels like we're looking at what's not there. Like there's the absence, like there's the absence of the perfect state that I expected
Yeah.
for myself. And then the shift into here's what is present. It changes everything. And I was thinking about that in relation to the sacred feminine, because we can look at the world through both of those lenses. We could say her absence is glaring, and it has been glaring over the last however many thousands and thousands of years. And it is wildly unfair and a crock of shit. We could say that, and that's a true statement. And I know for me, and I needed to be in that space for a little while. I needed to just be angry and frustrated and like look at everywhere that this has been taken from me. But when there was a shift to, whoa, like, well, she can't be gone because she wouldn't have found me if she were gone. First of all, I wouldn't have found her. And then I start to see the presence everywhere, like
Mm, yeah.
everywhere. And I don't know where I'm going with that. I wanted to share that with you though, because that feels like there's a thread of that in our conversation.
I feel it's a really wise thread. And I think you were so right how I was looking for the absence and basically what was wrong with me.
Yeah.
And I wasn't even seeing any goodness within myself as I was. And how can we, it was almost like I was doing all the quote unquote, the right stuff, the practices, but the true absence of love was the love I wasn't giving to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't meeting myself with that. And it was that absence was making me think I wasn't worthy. And that leaks into everywhere in our lives. And that's what I started to realize, that we compartmentalize in life and we think, well, I'm going to focus on this area of my life. But what you start to realize is it's actually leaked into every area of your life. And it wasn't until I really met that point of it's exactly what you said about starting to see the presence. I was able to see glaringly how I had let that impact every single aspect of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And 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 when we then have to come back to that place and start to see where is the love, and then remember that I am the love, and that it's
Mm.
been there all the time, and that I was there all the time, just disconnected, and I wasn't even able to see it. And it was almost like the very answers I needed, very simply, which is, what we all learned, it was already there. And it's like what you said about what the goddess, she has always been there in her hidden spaces, and she's been willing to show up to those who are ready to see her. And I think it's how we shift our vision, what we're willing to see and what we're not willing to see. I wasn't willing to see that I was okay, because everything in the world had told me that I wasn't okay. And I had, sold myself into that narrative willingly, under the guise of being better. And I'd lost the point of what even better was. I lost the point of what even truth was anymore. And I think there are a lot of people in that space, and they don't even, the truth is they don't even know it, because I think you can get so far lost down the rabbit hole that you don't even see the truth anymore. And it brings me such kind of gratitude to to those one or two kind of people that were in my life that were like, like what that therapist said to me, and like a few people said, why don't you just have some not controlled fun? Why don't you actually choose life, choose joy, choose to live? Like, and that has been such to fall back in love with life, and and to not control, because I feel like so many of us, especially women, like we look at what we can control in order to feel better, because that's all we've been able to do. And it's what you said, it's everything is our shift in perception, right? Our shift from fear into love, essentially.
Mm.
And one week, I feel we have to continually meet ourselves with that. And that there's, one of my favorite Rumi quotes is, beyond, there's a field, I'll meet you there, beyond the space of, right and wrong. And it was only when I met myself in the field that I met love.
Mm.
And it was like the journey back to myself was the journey that was the most healing. And that was like so powerful to have to witness that for myself. But also I knew from that point that there would have to be voice put to this, so that anyone else who'd ever felt that could hear, whether it's one person or whether it's 100 or more, that like that what happened there, somebody can start putting voice to this.
Mhm. I'm wondering how, yeah, you're already weaving in this concept of grace here, but I'm wondering then, and I hesitate to ask you to define grace, but that's what I'm going to ask you, like a broad, like, so then, because it kind of feels like we've been talking about grace this whole time, but what is your perspective on grace? What does that word mean to you, in the context of all that we've been talking about here?
It means peace for me,
Hmm.
because for so long I didn't feel peace. And I realized the greatest gift that we can have is inner peace. And there's a story, and I've told this story before, that many years ago I read the book Conversations with God. And there must have been this simple exercise in there to write something down, what you really want, and put it somewhere. I put it in one of these money pots that you have to crack open. And I put the little message in there and then forgot about it. And then many years later, I was in India, and I'd had a very deep and holy experience when I'd been at the Taj Mahal, and I'd really felt like a cycle ending. Yeah, I'd almost felt like my entire life flashed before me in like a very small number of seconds. It was a very surreal experience. So when I got home, for some reason, I decided to get into the money pot. I'd actually managed to get most of the money out over the years that you put in, because we always find ingenious ways when we need some cash, right? But
Hmm.
what I didn't know was this message was in the pot. And I couldn't even remember putting the message in the pot. So then I get open the pot and I see this bit of paper, and I was like, holy moly, what is on this piece of paper? What did I want? I suddenly remembered doing it, and I thought, was it love? Was it money? Was it sex? Like, what was it? And it simply said peace, inner peace.
Hmm.
And it blew my mind because I suddenly sat there and was like, Mother Goddess, whoever I had that moment of, and thankfully you helped me come to a place of more peace. And it was a real defining moment to realize that all of the wonderful material things that we can want, there is one thing beyond all of those things, and it's peace. And what that represents. And for me, that is deeply woven into grace.
Hmm. I love that. Yeah, there's a thought that's been kind of floating around for me, and it's not very formed yet, but something around the idea of enough, which I feel like that could be another theme to what you and I have been talking about. Like, is what I have enough? Am I enough? Am I good enough to
Am I
be?
worthy?
Yes, yes, and that absence of feeling enoughness, which we've outsourced, I think, in a lot of our spiritual traditions, and put that in the hands of a being that we imagine to be totally separate from us,
Mm.
and then imagine like how we're trying to answer it, based on church rules or whatever, and that feeling, that lack of enoughness, is perhaps one of many reasons why our planet is in so much trouble, because when you don't feel like you're enough, then there's just this constant like mindless trying to fill it with whatever it is, like in your case with like some kind of healing modality, but we could go after money, we could go after status, we could go after power, and in doing so we lose sight, of course, of relationships or anything else, and yeah, so I've been
Yeah.
thinking about that a lot too. Yeah.
It leaks everywhere. Like I said, what we don't realize is that when we're in that energy space, that energy will leak into every area of our lives. And ultimately what you've talked about, that not enough and that outsourcing, is patriarchy, right?
Yes.
It's from the little girl versions of us that never felt enough. And she came with us on this entire life journey and is meeting us at all of our different ages, that are whatever we are, and still meeting many of us until we say enough, until we draw the line, until we say, I'm going to be okay. And 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 it takes so much unpacking. I feel it meets us in layers. I feel it meets us in, it will meet us as soon as we have the awareness and we recognize that. My goodness, it meets us in all of the different places and spaces, through people, through things. We will be met. And that's where the grace comes in, because that's when we've got to meet ourselves with grace, and we have to meet it with grace. And
Yeah.
just remember, beyond all of that, that there is this deeper thread of
Mhm.
in a word, love.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. And so tell us about your podcast then, and then the other ways in which you are bringing this. I start saying message, which I feel it's like a little trite. It's more than that. But tell us how you're presencing this in the world.
So I've got my podcast where I'm obviously interviewing a wide range of people. And
Yeah.
obviously, as you pointed out, speaking myself, which was the challenge to myself when someone said, how about just coming in, showing up? So it's been a real blessing to do my little 20-minute monthly episode, which I started in the pandemic, actually. That the solo episodes, you can find me there. You can find me on my website. I do like a blog of just my musings. I have a newsletter, and I am writing a book as well. So there
Mm.
will be a deeper message, and someone that's ready to bring more difficult conversations to this world, and also challenge some of the narratives that many of us have bought into as well. The
Mhm.
inner rebel is ever fired, as always. In it's like the goddess has a little sneaky laugh with me, because she's like, we made this one a little bit rebelly, just for the laughs. And so
Mm.
yeah, so that's where you can find me. And obviously on my social, mostly on Instagram at the Hannah Wallace. Yeah, there is a good place where I'm continuously sharing, this perspective in different ways.
Mhm. Yeah, and on your podcast, how are you, like, tell me some of the different ways you're coming at this idea of grace, because you've had a really interesting variety of people on your show. So tell me about how you're kind of creating that, curating that.
You're right. Really, really, I trust my instincts. If I feel like there can be a good conversation to have. What fascinates me is obviously the question I ask everybody is, what does finding grace mean to you? And I love that no matter how many times you ask that question, A, people love that question, but B, that question brings up something different in everyone. And I feel humbled by that, really, in that there is so many facets to this, and I find that deeply magical, then, to be able to weave a conversation through that to what that person's doing in the world, and what's bringing them joy. And I always ask people now, I started to ask people, what's bringing you joy right now? Not what you're doing, but what's bringing you joy? It's making you happy beyond your purpose, beyond all this stuff. What's really making you happy? And for me, that is grace as well, because I want to know. And the more we can get people aligned with that, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, absolutely. I know. And I feel like that feels like a really nice place for us to wind down to. And I want to leave that with the listeners. I feel like these are good questions if you've got a few minutes to think about, like, where are you finding joy in your life, and what does finding grace mean to you? And whatever answer that may be, I can't remember what I said to you when I was on your show, and it might be different today, which is also okay, right? That the answers
And
can be
that's what I
fluid.
love,
Yeah.
that you can have a different answer, but also, what's making you happy, and if you're not feeling happy, what can you do to meet yourself there more? I think,
Mhm.
it's the one question we can ask yourself. And what do you, well, what do you really, sometimes it's more not what's not making you happy, but what do you really want? 'Cause sometimes we know what we want that can bring us more happiness, but we're afraid to go there. So by asking that question, we're giving ourselves the invitation to look at that as well.
Mhm. Absolutely. Mm. Hannah, thank you so much. This has been such a beautiful conversation. It's an honor to be with you. Much
Mm,
gratitude.
much gratitude to you as well. Thank you.
And I will make sure I put in the show notes all the different ways that you can find Hannah, her podcast, Finding Grace. But yeah, all of her social, it will all be there. And to all of you listeners, thank you as always for coming along on this ride with me. I'm grateful for you. I find joy and happiness in these conversations, and I've said it before. I'd probably do this if you weren't listening, because it makes me happy to do this, but it makes me even more happy that people want to listen in and be part of it. So thank you all for tuning in. And if you like the show, you can leave it a favorable review. You can subscribe. You can tell a friend about it. You can do all those things. And until next time, take very good care of yourselves, and I will talk to you again soon.